Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025. And for today's episode, this will be movies number, let me think here, 348 through 353. So, with today's episode, which is an episode that I was supposed to have done like a week ago. But just, based on everything that's been going on and just life and work and just a lot of other things, shit happens, right? But I wanted to make this up to you guys. I wanted to make sure that I would make this goal of watching the 500 movies in 2025. Because I only have like little over 2 months left in the year to meet that goal. And with this episode, ending at 353, I said, that's still a lot of movies just in a little over 2 months. And you know, I really want to just kind of get caught up to speed here. So to start off October and just and celebrating the season and the spirit of Halloween all month long, I wanted to start this off by doing a triple stream this weekend to try to get caught up. So we're going to be talking about 6 different movies tonight. Tomorrow night on Saturday night, I'm going to be talking about 5 more movies. And then on Sunday, 5 more movies on that day. So altogether, you got 16 movies that I'm going to be talking about in the span of 3 days. And I got several more other movies coming up for the rest of the month. And all these movies are, a part of the Halloween Hoedown event that I have created here on CraterMania. And all these movies I'm going to be talking about all month long are going to be based around my favorite holiday of the year, and that's Halloween. So either it's going to be like around the holiday, or it's going to be like on the holiday. Just everything, just involving that whole spirit of Halloween in these movies. And these are some of my favorite movies, just growing up and throughout the years that I've watched. Based around the holiday, because Halloween is super important to me. And if you know me very well, you know I am a huge horror movie fan and just everything monsters and spooky and macabre. Just, that is my personality in a nutshell. And, a lot of that has to do not just with horror movies, but just with the season of Halloween itself. As a kid, every year that I was growing up, I loved Halloween. I was so excited. I was so excited about just the decorations and just the whole aesthetic of the holiday. Just people, just kind of dressing in a certain type of fashion, or the costumes on trick or treat, the movies and the specials and stuff they would have on TV. Um, just everything about it just gave off this vibe that I absolutely loved, and I just fell in love with more and more as the years went by. And it's just really shaped who I am as a person, thanks to Halloween and all that spooky stuff that's just so important to me. And, what better way than to just celebrate all of that here on CraterMania on my YouTube channel as a part of the 500 movies in 2025 by talking about some of those favorite movies of mine throughout the years, um, that's based around the whole spirit of Halloween. And so let's just go ahead and kick this off, the whole Halloween Hoedown event, by talking about one of the oldest movies that I can think of, that's one of my favorites, that's based around the Halloween holiday. And I think my dad actually really loves this movie too. Not just because like it's one of these old school horror films from the 50s, but it also stars Michael Landon. And my dad was a huge fan of Michael Landon. As I was growing up, I was watching shows like Little House on the Prairie and Highway to Heaven. And so this movie There's actually an homage to this movie in an episode of Highway to Heaven, where Michael Landon, um, he like kind of pays homage to the character he plays in this movie, and this is I Was a Teenage Werewolf from 1957. And for any horror fan, especially those with just a fondness for that kind of chilling allure of Halloween, the whole month of October just kind of conjures this specific kind of cinematic craving. It's just a time for that, the crisp air and the rustling leaves, and just, in that comforting, it's slightly unsettling, embrace of these classic creature features. While many iconic beasts, have clawed their way into our kind of collective consciousness. And, I talked about that a lot in the past too, when I did the whole World of Werewolves series here on the channel. Um, there's just this undeniable charm in revisiting these films that, while perhaps not masterpieces of terror, they still really laid that groundwork, for the whole genre's like enduring appeal. And for me, this Halloween season, that particular scratch was, best satisfied just by a dive into this surprisingly earnest, if undeniably campy, just world of this movie from 1957. I Was a Teenage Werewolf. You know, at its core, it's just a tale of this kind of adolescent angst, that was amplified by this monstrous curse. And so we meet Tony Rivers, who's played by Michael Landon here. And, he's this high school student, is kind of wrestling with this temper, that kind of often lands him in hot water. And, these kind of outbursts that that comes out of him just really catch the attention of this detective Donovan, who suggests that that Tony seek help from Dr. Brandon, who is this psychologist that has is experimenting with which is hypnotherapy, and this kind of rather uncertain serum. So Tony, he's resistant, and eventually, but he succumbs to this kind of growing, aggression within him. And just, particularly, after this incident at this Halloween party that was held in this local haunt that, the teenagers at his school had put together. So this leads him, to Dr. Brandon's office, where the good doctor reveals his ambitious and it's ethically questionable plan here. So and that is to regress Tony's personality to this kind of primal animalistic roots. And with the help of this assistant, which is Dr. Hugo, Dr. Brandon administers the serum, kind of masking it as a sedative, and just begins this kind of series of these hypnotic sessions that's just designed to unleash this inner beast, in Tony. So the seeds of terror are kind of sown here, when one of Tony's friends, Frank, is found brutally murdered. And there's these distinctive fang marks on the victim's body, and it kind of piques the interest of Detective Donovan and Chief Baker. But the lack of wild animals in that vicinity kind of leaves them baffled. They're like, what the fuck is going on here? So their confusion is dismissed by, I think the guy's name is Peppy. He's like the police station janitor. And he's this guy that's in the with these roots in the Carpathian Mountains, which is the very homeland of werewolves. So as Tony undergoes these further sessions with Dr. Brandon, his unease starts to grow, and it's just a feeling that something is terribly wrong here. And this kind of unsettling premonition culminates in this very horrific transformation within Tony. And so, he's triggered by just the shrill ring of a school bell, at his high school. and Tony just morphs into this werewolf, and when he brutally attacks and kills Teresa, who's this woman, that was alone in the high school gym. So there's these eyewitnesses, and then they identify Tony, by his clothes and all that, and this all points bulletin is issued out. So the following morning, Tony wakes up. He's human again, and he rushes back to Dr. Brandon, and he's just begging for assistance. However, Dr. Brandon, he's kind of blinded by this pride within him, this scientific pride, and he just sees this as an opportunity. He wants to capture Tony's transformation on film to just kind of prove, like what's going on within this kind of experimental procedure that he has concocted. So he injects Tony with this the serum again, and this time this a ringing telephone acts as like the catalyst, and Tony, transforms again, and he starts to unleash his fury, upon Dr. Brandon and Dr. Hugo, and just destroys the camera and the film just in this kind of chaotic frenzy. So the authorities, they're tipped off to all this, and to Tony's presence and that, and so they converge on to the scene here, and there's Detective Donovan and this other officer bursts in, and there's this kind of tense standoff between them, and they shoot Tony multiple times. So as Tony starts to succumb to his wounds and all that, um, his human features start to reappear, and it leaves Detective Donovan to kind of ponder, these dark implications, of Dr. Brandon's kind of meddling in all this, and just, kind of the folly of men, playing God. Um, and this movie is such a fun one to watch, and it was directed by Gene Fowler Jr. And it isn't typically, that first film that springs to mind, when you're discussing these kind of werewolf films, or Halloween films in general. But Gene Fowler Jr. was primarily a film editor, and this was with this directorial effort, you know um, while notable for its subject matter, it doesn't really showcase any kind of groundbreaking, visual artistry. Um, but his other directorial credits are just largely in television. With a few low budget independent films kind of scattered throughout his career. Um, he's not a name that conjures visions of kind of iconic directorial styles. Um, However, within the context of this specific film, um, his direction kind of serves the story very competently. Just focusing on the story progression, and this character's internal struggle. Um, there's the pacing of the film. Why it's sometimes kind of like you know off, in comparison to modern standards, it effectively still builds that kind of sense of dread, and Tony's, descent into madness. Um, and the legacy and the impact of I Was a Teenage Werewolf is, undoubtedly more significant than its kind of individual, artistic merit would suggest. Um, it was released during this kind of burgeoning era of this, that teenage centric cinema, in the 1950s. And it tapped into this kind of cultural atmosphere, where these adolescent anxieties and that kind of burgeoning sexuality were starting to be explored more and more on screen. And, the film's title itself became like an instant hook to a lot of audiences, and it really resonated with a youthful audience who could, perhaps see a more distorted reflection of their own, sometimes uncontrollable emotions and the pressures that society would put on them during that era. Um, it was one of the first of many like teen horror films. It really paved the way, for like later, explorations of just monster movies that were kind of aimed, squarely at a younger demographic. Um, and while the special effects are, kind of basic, compared to today's standards, um, Michael Landon's werewolf transformation was just kind of achieved through makeup and this hairy costume. It's more endearingly cheesy than terrifying, but I think for this time, they were effective enough, for the time, and it really contributed to the film's cult status, which remains to this day. Um, it's a very foundational piece, in the whole teen monster subgenre. And it's also like a very playful precursor, to the kind of more elaborate and often more, graphic transformations that would kind of become a staple of horror cinema and the whole werewolf subgenre, like American Werewolf in London, The Howling, and just so many others, out there. Like it's it's an embrace of the whole werewolf mythology, and just the history and the legacy of werewolves on film. Um, excuse me. It was just just really filtered through this lens of kind of adolescent turmoil, and it really cemented its place in B movie horror history. It's a film that kind of, despite its the few minor flaws, it really understands that kind of power of suggestion, and just the kind of inherent dread of losing control, just themes that, I think for any horror fan, especially during, like the time of Halloween, it just remains eternally compelling to a lot of people, including myself. But in conclusion, I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Um, it isn't, an earth-shattering horror experience or anything, but I feel that it is a film that, has earned its spot in the whole Halloween viewing rotation. It's a creature feature that's more about, the internal monster than that external gore, that's seen on screen. Which I think is a testament to, just the anxieties of youth that was amplified by, supernatural forces. Its directness, it's earnest, it's if somewhat simplistic, approach to the werewolf legend, and its undeniable place in the evolution of like teen horror, really make it a very worthwhile revisit. Excuse me. But for those who love movies that that capture that specific, slightly campy, energy that Halloween often evokes, then I think this 1957 classic, really offers a charmingly hairy and undeniable fun ride. It's a reminder, I think, that sometimes, the most satisfying scares, come from films that, much like, say, a beloved Halloween decoration, just has this very timeless, if very timeless appeal about it. So, definitely, if you've never watched, I Was a Teenage Werewolf from 1957, and you're a fan of werewolf films, or you're a fan of Michael Landon, or, you're just, you're a fan of like just teenage angst films. Um, Definitely check out this movie. It's a fun one. It's not one that a lot of people talk about when you're talking about Halloween season movies, but it's definitely such a fun movie. So yeah, definitely don't pass this one up. If you ever have the time, you want to just definitely check this one out. All right, so moving on to the next movie, and this next movie I've watched several times. I feel like this is an absolute masterpiece of a film. I remember the last time I watched it was this past week for the Halloween Hoedown here on CraterMania. But the time before that, I think the last time I watched before that was when they showed it on the Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. Um, and this is a very early film in the career of Jodie Foster. She was a very young girl when they did this movie, and and for those of us who kind of find ourselves, drawn to those deeper, more psychological corners of horror, especially those that bloom with just that the kind of decaying beauty, of the Halloween season, then this movie, The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane from 1976, not another typical Halloween season movie, but it does take place on Halloween. And it just really stands as a kind of peculiar and, really powerful gem of a movie. And like I said, while it's not overtly a Halloween movie in the traditional sense, it's has this very oppressive atmosphere, its exploration of just hidden, darkness, lurking beneath kind of a seemingly innocent facade, and just its use of just that unsettling tension really forges a powerful connection to just the spirit of the season. um this film isn't just watched, it's felt. It's a very slow burn unease that just kind of seeps into the viewer's soul and your bones. Just much like kind of that encroaching chill of late October. Um, and I know that's cliche, but I'm a cliche guy, so whatever. But anyway, at its heart, the little girl who lives down the lane is just a carefully crafted, character study that is just wrapped in this kind of deeply, disturbing mystery. The story plunges us, just into this kind of solitary world of Ren Jacobs, who, is portrayed, by a very young Jodie Foster. It's one of her earliest and most impactful roles, in my opinion. So it's a Halloween night. It's a night kind of steeped in the macabre and this and all that's spooky. And 13-year-old Ren is celebrating her birthday alone in this secluded seaside cottage. So she and her poet father Lester, who's this kind of man that's shrouded in mystery by his absence, have just recently relocated from England. And this kind of isolation is just immediately unmistakable. This kind of self-imposed exile that just hints at these very deeper and more complex reasons for their presence. And the film's descent into unease really begins with just the intrusion of Frank Hallett, who's this predatory adult son of their landlady Cora Hallett. And so Frank Hallett, played by Martin Sheen here, by the way, his unwelcome and like overtly sexual advances toward Ren kind of reveals, these vulnerabilities of her very isolated state. And the following confrontation with Cora is just a masterclass, in escalating tension. And Cora, excuse me, I need to get a drink real quick before I continue. All right. All right. So anyway, as I was saying, Cora, who is just this woman that was consumed by nosiness and suspicion, she starts to probe Ren with these kind of increasingly, invasive questions, just attempting to kind of unravel these secrets that Ren so fiercely guards. Um, So, that animosity just culminates in Cora's, insistent demand to retrieve these jelly glasses from the cellar, which is a space that Ren desperately tries to keep off limits. So the ensuing accident, which is, just a tragic and gruesome demise for Cora, is not a moment of catharsis, but just rather this kind of chilling, escalation of Ren's predicament. Um, and the film doesn't reveal in gore or anything, but just that kind of icy calm with in which Ren, confronts and disposes of the evidence of her landlady's death. Just a very chilling realism that kind of contradicts, her tender years. Um, but then you have the arrival of Mario, who is this local teenager. He kind of offers this glimmer of connection with Ren. But even this is kind of fraught with Ren's and guardedness. And his assistance in maneuvering the situation with Cora's body and that kind of following reward of a home cooked meal really creates a fragile bond. However, the shadow of Frank Hallett, continues to loom, on the property, and his persistent, inquiries about his, missing mother, and Ren's father, forcing the facade to start to crumble, and Frank's cruel murder. And I hate this part in the movie. I fucking hate it. Uh, he murders Ren's pet hamster, and I absolutely hate that part in the movie, but it develops and it evolves the story, and it just makes you hate Frank, more and more because it's just a very particularly vicious act, not just an attack on an animal, but just a brutal violation, of Ren's already fragile emotional landscape. And it's just a desperate attempt to kind of extract information through terror and intimidation. So it's in the wake of this cruelty that Ren finally confides in Mario, revealing this kind of devastating backstory. And her father, who's terminally ill, and escaping this abusive ex-wife, orchestrated their relocation and his own suicide. Just leaving Ren with a kind of vial of, potassium cyanide, which is a very chilling inheritance meant to protect her from her mother's clutches. Um, and, Ren's kind of matter of fact, recounting of her mother's death by poison is perhaps one of the most unnerving aspects of the entire film. And it showcases just this kind of chilling detachment that was born from like trauma and self-preservation. But then there's this kind of budding romance that starts to happen between Ren and Mario, and um just a fragile shoot of hope in the kind of grim soil of her existence. And really that's a testament to her capacity for connection amidst immense darkness that's happening in her life. Um but even that kind of grim act of burying the bodies becomes this strangely shared intimate secret, and it really solidifies the bond between Ren and Mario. Um but the film's director here, which is Nicholas Gessner, though perhaps again not another household name, for blockbuster thrills, that his name, possesses a kind of remarkable talent for, cultivating atmosphere and just that psychological dread. He had this very keen eye for detail, and his just ability to draw out nuanced performances from his actors, and that's all on full display here. Um, and Gessner is kind of known for his work more in European cinema, kind of often exploring themes of isolation and identity, and just the kind of darker aspects of human nature. And the little girl who lives down the lane is arguably, I think, his most impactful and enduring contribution to film, and just as a departure into a more suspenseful and unsettling territory that just clearly has resonated with audiences for years and years, for decades. You know, And just the legacy and the impact of this movie is really undeniable. Particularly for those who kind of appreciate films that linger, on and on in your mind. This is definitely one of those for me. Um, even especially for like during the Halloween season. It's a film that defied genre expectations. It blurred the lines between kind of coming of age drama and psychological thriller and just even elements of that kind of proto feminist horror um, that's super popular nowadays. Ren isn't a victim in the traditional sense. I mean, she's a survivor. She's an architect of her own destiny. Um, however grim that destiny may be. And Jodie Foster's performance is legendary here in this film. Just a star-making turn for her that really showcased her extraordinary ability just to embody these kind of complex, often unsettling characters. Um, and we see a lot of that in her role in Taxi Driver as well. Um, but the film's enduring appeal lies in this kind of raw portrayal of childhood trauma. It's in that exploration of the lengths that one will go to just to survive, um, and its refusal to kind of offer these easy answers or these comfortable resolutions as well. I mean, it challenges viewers to confront the uncomfortable realities of just innocence being lost at such a young age, and just that darkness that can bloom, in these most unexpected places. Um, but the little girl who lives down the lane is really more than just a movie. It's an experience. It's a just a chilling, descent into that kind of psyche of a young girl, forced to navigate this very treacherous world with just this, unnerving blend of guile and vulnerability. And for fans of just those atmospheric, character driven thrillers, especially those who find their kind of there's these spooky inclinations stirred by, undercurrents of Halloween. Um, this film definitely offers a deeply satisfying and profoundly unsettling journey. I think it's a testament to just the power of quiet dread, the strength of just a formidable, young performance, and just that enduring allure, of a story that just kind of dares to explore, the darkness kind of lurking down the lane, if you will. Um, but yeah, definitely check out The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. If you just want to see something different this Halloween season, definitely check it out. If you're a Jodie Foster fan or a Martin Sheen fan, definitely want to watch these. This was a big one for both of their careers, in my opinion, that really helped them evolve in their careers for years to come. So yeah, check out The Little Girl That Lives Down the Lane, and I don't think you guys will be very disappointed because this movie is an absolute masterpiece. Um, but that brings me to the next movie on the list. So this movie, I introduced this movie to my dad probably about a year or so ago, and he absolutely loves this movie now. And I have such a funny story about this movie when it comes to the creator of it, J.D. Feigelson. So, when I first became aware of this movie, it was only about back in like 2009 when I first ever heard about this movie because there were, a lot of news on horror sites and stuff and horror podcasts. I know Dead Pit was talking about it, about this finally being released on DVD for the first time ever. And I remember being at a convention. I think it was at Fright Night Film Fest in Louisville, Kentucky. And I remember just randomly talking to this guy that was standing there at the convention and on the convention floor because and I don't know a stranger. I'll talk to anybody. So I'll just randomly like start having conversations with other fans at these conventions and stuff. And I just thought that this guy was just, another fan at the show. Didn't realize who he was. Um, and we got started talking about like movies and stuff, and then he started talking about Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, and I was like, "Oh, well, yeah, I've never seen it. I know, that it's popular right now in the news or whatever." I said, and I know they're getting ready to bring it on DVD. And he goes, "Oh, you've never seen it?" And I was like, "No, no, no." It's like I said, "Is it? Have you seen it? Is it good?" And he's like, "Yeah, I created it." And I was like, "Wait, what?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "I'm JD Fagelson. I'm the writer and the creator of Dark Knight of the Scarecrow." And my mind was blown. My mind was fucking blown by this. And so I would see him for years to come at conventions, and I'd always meet up and we'd have these conversations all the time. So it's almost like we came to know each other, on a personal level. And that's super cool. And yeah, so Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, 1981. For many of us, just who kind of grew up with this kind of deep affection, as I've talked about several times, for all things Halloween, there are certain films that just become more than just a seasonal viewing for us. They become these kind of cherished traditions. And they're really woven into the very fabric of the holiday. And I think, among these, treasured, experiences, uh, that 1981 made for TV film, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, really holds a particular special place in my heart and many other fans out there for sure. And like I said, I introduced to my dad about a year or so ago, and he absolutely loves it now too. It's a film that, while perhaps not as widely known as some as of its theatrical counterparts, it really possesses this powerful and atmospheric and just profoundly moving, quality that continues to resonate with fans, especially those who kind of find solace and spirit in Halloween, and just the magic of Halloween and all, and just the whole spirit of the season. This isn't just a horror movie, it's this tale of innocence, injustice, and just kind of spectral, vengeance that feels both earned and tragically beautiful, in my opinion. So Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, I think, is a testament to the fact that, compelling storytelling and just genuine, emotional impact can transcend, the limitations of television production. And, as I said before, this was crafted by the visionary J.D. Feigelson, who, wrote the original teleplay, and, just it was brought to life by the skilled direction of Frank De Felitta. And the film was just a rare jewel, in that landscape of made for TV films. While, originally it was intended as, this independent feature, you know, uh, when CBS acquired this for TV, it, surprisingly resulted in these kind of minimal alterations, and it really preserved just that raw emotional core, of JD Feigelson's vision. Um, the film's story kind of unfolds, in this small, sun-drenched town, in the deep South, and it's just a setting that kind of provides excuse me, provides a stark contrast to just the darkness, brewing beneath its surface. Um, so, at its heart is this tender and unlikely friendship between a man named Bubba, which I believe his real name, that was just his nickname. I think his real name in the movie was like Charles Elliott Ritter or something. But, he's played by Larry Drake, and who some people may know as the evil, sinister Santa Claus in Tales from the Crypt, or, as Dr. Giggles. And he's also in Dark Man and several other things. But, Bubba was a man of immense size, but with this kind of profoundly, gentle and just simple spirit. And then you have, that friendship, that unlikely friendship that he has with this very young Mary Lee Williams. So this very innocent bond, however, becomes kind of a catalyst for tragedy when it draws the attention of the town's kind of less savory elements. So among them is Otis Hazelrig, played by Charles Durning, who is this very brooding and deeply malicious postal worker who just has this twisted sense of morality, and that's fueling his animosity towards this friendship between Bubba and Mary Lee. Um, so these kind of simmering tensions erupt when Mary Lee is attacked by this vicious dog. And Otis, who's just blinded by his prejudice against Bubba, and this he hates seeing them as his friends even though it's innocent. He just feels like there's something wrong about it. So he has this need to kind of assign blame, and he immediately points that towards Bubba. And just kind of fueled by this mob mentality, he rallies these three like-minded individuals, which there's Skeeter, who's this gas station attendant, and just these farmer cousins, Philby and Heartless. They all form this kind of vigilante posse. So they track Bubba, who has just been disguised as as a scarecrow. He disguised himself as the scarecrow in this nearby field, and just in a desperate attempt to hide, to get away from this mob that's after him. So tragically, their bloodhounds locate him, and then the helpless Bubba is just brutally gunned down by these four men. Um, so the true horror, both emotional and narrative, uh, starts to dawn when the killers discover that Mary Lee is in fact alive and well, um, because she was rescued by Bubba himself, and in this kind of desperate attempt, to cover their tracks and just to frame their victim, Otis plants a pitchfork in Bubba's lifeless hands, just kind of staging a scene of a violent attack. So when the vigilantes are brought to trial, their testimony kind of riddled with, perjury and just aided by, this lack of, concrete evidence leads to them being acquitted. And, the injustice is palpable here, and just the seed of supernatural retribution is sown. So, Mary Lee recovers, but her innocence remains, largely untarnished. Um, she misses Bubba intensely, and eventually, sneaks out to his home, seeking, trying to seek her friend out. And Bubba's mother, Mrs. Ritter, is heartbroken and just, unable to articulate that devastating truth, tells Marilee that Bubba has gone away. And, Marilee, however, is not so easily deterred from this. She ventures out to the field where Bubba was killed, just sitting beneath that stake where he was killed. And she's singing this song, that was dear to her and Bubba. So with this young child's kind of unwavering conviction, she assures her mother and Bubba's mother that Bubba's just merely playing, this hiding game. So this kind of quiet assertion of belief really sets the stage, for the film's kind of escalating spectral revenge. Um, so sometime later, Harless discovers, this scarecrow in his field, which is eerily similar to the one that Bubba was disguised as. So, the appearance to him is unsettling. And Otis, ever the instigator, suspects that the town's district attorney, Sam, um, orchestrated this to kind of like get to them, kind of unnerve them. Um, but soon, this Scarecrow vanishes, only for Harless, to just to meet this gruesome end in his own barn, just falling into this like self-activated wood chipper or whatever. Um, so the death of Harless, sends a whole ripple of fear through Otis and Philby and Skeeter, and they realized that this was no accident, and they discovered the wood chipper had been deliberately switched off after Harless's death. So Otis starts to get paranoid, and it starts to grow and grow in him, and he starts to accuse Bubba's mother, Mrs. Ritter, suggesting that Bubba has been avenged and declaring a life for a life. So Mrs. Ritter, however, stands firm, hinting at other forces that will see justice done, and implying that Otis's inappropriate interest in Mary Lee. So again, the Scarecrow reappears. This time it's in Philby's field, and this kind of chilling, harbinger of what's to come. So the film really masterfully weaves, just the Halloween atmosphere into this kind of unfolding tragedy. So, during the town's Halloween party, while playing hide and seek, Mary Lee is confronted by Otis, and he's trying to get this information, out of her about, Mrs. Ritter's alleged involvement. But Mary Lee, with this kind of this clarity that you know, due to her age, she reveals her knowledge of just her crime, and she runs away. So Otis's pursuit of her is kind of thwarted, but the Scarecrow's presence continues to haunt them. So Philby and Otis, find the Scarecrow again gone from his field, only for Philby to meet his terrifying end, and he's buried alive in this grain silo. And that's one of the moments in the movie that's always like came off as like claustrophobic to me, and it's absolutely terrifying just to think about to die in that kind of scenario. Um, so, this escalating body count starts to kind of fuel Otis's delusion. He becomes convinced that Bubba is alive and is just orchestrating this vengeance himself. So, I mean, that's how delusion. I mean, him and three other guys fucking killed this Bubba, and now he's thinking that Bubba is actually still alive and is orchestrating all of these murders of his posse or whatever. So Otis and Skeeter, they go to exhume Bubba's grave, expecting to find an empty coffin. So the revelation that Bubba's body is still there, however, it starts to send Skeeter into this panic, and Otis, his madness is fully unleashed here, and he brutally murders Skeeter and buries him in the grave. So the final confrontation sees Otis in this kind of just drunken madness. It shows him he encounters Mary Lee in the middle of the road, and just his pursuit leads to a crash and this desperate chase through this pumpkin patch. So cornered, Otis accuses Mary Lee, but this nearby plowing machine just comes to life, and it's like it's operated by this phantom, some kind of ghost, just really mirroring the supernatural forces that's at play here. So in this absolute terror, Otis runs headlong into the Scarecrow, just now holding the very pitchfork that was planted on Bubba's corpse, and he ends up impaling himself, which is a very fiddly, grim end for him. And he finally acknowledges this spectral justice this, almost like afterworld justice. So, as he dies, Marilee, is hidden. And she sees the Scarecrow start to approach her, and it offers her a flower. And with this kind of simple, and she responds with this very simple, profound, "Thank you, Bubba." And the truth is revealed. Bubba's spirit has returned, and he's inhabited, this Scarecrow to exact revenge on his killers. So Mary Lee, her innocence now kind of intertwined with this ghostly guardian, smiles and just ready to teach Bubba a new game. And I absolutely love that ending. Um, this is one of probably my favorite Halloween movies to watch. Um, and as I said before, the director behind Dark Knight of the Scarecrow was this accomplished novelist, Frank De Felitta. And De Felitta was this, was a writer and filmmaker, which is a fascination for, the supernatural and the psychological. He is, I think, perhaps best known, for his novels, such as Audrey Rose, which explored themes of, reincarnation and the supernatural. And it was later adapted into a successful film that he also directed. And his work kind of often delved into just the darker aspects of human experience. Just with a kind of particular interest in just the kind of uncanny and the boundaries of reality. And he brought this kind of same nuance, understanding of suspense and that unsettling to Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, which he just crafted this film that really relies on atmosphere and dread as much as on its kind of supernatural elements. Um, and just his author background really lent the film this kind of literary depth that was unusual for a TV production. And it allowed for a more um, profound exploration of just grief and injustice and just you know overall that enduring power of love. um and the legacy and the impact of Dark Knight and the Scarecrow is deeply felt within the kind of niche of Halloween and horror enthusiasts, particularly those who appreciate films that blend that genuine emotion with these supernatural thrills. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about this, and it has this very enduring appeal, that lies in several key factors. For one, the innocence of Bubba. I think the film's greatest strength is its kind of sympathetic, hero here, or anti-hero, whatever you want to call him. Bubba is not, this typical horror movie villain or victim. He's just this flawed, gentle soul who is brutally wronged, and his portrayal, who's often by an actor, who embodies his kind of simple kindness, really creates a powerful empathy in the audience. And I think that this makes, his tragic death, and, the subsequent, supernatural vengeance deeply satisfying. It's like a cathartic release for viewers who have witnessed such profound injustice. And I know you guys know what I mean, because I know so many people that I've talked to that's watched movies and like they see people get wronged. And like look at The Crow, for example. Like what happened with the character of Eric Draven, and then after he comes back to life and he goes after his murderers, both him and his girlfriend Shelly. um, it's just like we're cheering on. It's like, yeah, get those motherfuckers, go kill them all. That's that's all of us as a whole. Like that's what we feel when we watch a movie like that. And it's the same thing with this movie. Like I said, just the film really validates the audience's sense of fairness, and their desire to see this, the downtrodden, you know find this ultimate justice, even if it comes from beyond the grave. Um, and another thing about it is just the atmospheric Halloween setting. It masterfully utilizes the aesthetic, of Halloween and that rural, Southern life. The film is just very imbued with a sense of dread, and the rustling cornfields, and just the looming scarecrows, the crisp night air, and just that small town intimacy, all contributes to a very rich, immersive atmosphere that just perfectly complements the horror. And this makes it just an ideal watch, in my opinion, for the season. Just kind of evoking that essence of spooky traditions, and just the magic of trick or treating, under this, a harvest moon or whatever. The film doesn't just tell, a Halloween story. It feels like Halloween. You know what I mean? And there's also this very unique take on vengeance. Unlike many slasher films where the killer is just purely evil, Bubba's vengeance in Dark Knight of the Scarecrow is presented as this kind of righteous, almost sympathetic response to horrific injustice. The supernatural elements are not gratuitous. They are the logical, although they're otherworldly, consequence of just the town's cruelty. And the film's exploration of the supernatural, just through that kind of embodiment, of a scarecrow, is iconic, and really provides a unique, visual motif, I guess, that has become, synonymous with the film. It taps into that kind of that fear, and folklore, surrounding scarecrows, giving them this kind of chilling new dimension about them. And beyond all the scares here, there's an emotional resonance within this film. Dark Knight of the Scarecrow carries this kind of significant emotional weight. Just that profound love between Bubba and Mary Lee, and the grief of Mrs. Ritter, and just that kind of pervasive, sense of community gone wrong, all contributes to this story that is just as heartbreaking as it is horrifying. The film's ability to kind of elicit, genuine sadness alongside terror is an absolute testament to its effective storytelling, and the character development. And I had to talk about just the cult classic status. Like I said, while this aired on television, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow has just achieved a true cult classic status nowadays. It's a film that fans seek out and share, and just revisit year after year. And I know that I have. I'm one of those people that revisits this year after year ever since I discovered it back, whatever it was, 2009, 2010. You know, and just its reputation has grown through word of mouth. Like I said, its availability on various home video formats now. It's a film that just continues to be discovered and cherished by just new generations of horror fans who are looking for something beyond the mainstream. Um, and its impact is seen and just that kind of continued affection that it receives from its dedicated fan base who champion it as a vital part of the annual Halloween viewings of movies and specials. And that includes me. Like I said, I watch this movie at least once every year. It's one of my favorite Halloween movies to watch. But in conclusion, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, definitely stands as this shining, chilling example of what a made-for-TV film could achieve. It's a rare gem that just perfectly encapsulates the whole spirit of Halloween. And it weaves these kind of tales of innocence lost and brutal injustice, and just that ultimate spectral retribution. Um, the film's ability to kind of evoke a very potent atmosphere, coupled with its, deeply sympathetic, hero or anti-hero, however you wanted to, perceive him as, and this haunting, vengeance that he's unleashing is just really cemented its place, in just the hearts of fans who kind of yearn for, this Halloween viewing experience that is just both, terrifying and profoundly moving. It's a testament to just the enduring power of a well-told story. A reminder that sometimes, the most heartfelt stories of justice come from the most unexpected, and scariest places, I guess. For anyone who cherishes, just the magic of Halloween and enjoys just a story that will really linger in your mind and just, and make an emotional impact on you. Dark Night of the Scarecrow just really remains this essential and captivating and beloved classic in my eyes. So definitely, you guys, if you love horror films, if you love horror films based around Halloween, if you love anything that kind of blends all of that with this, deeply caring, emotion about it, and that is profoundly moving, do not sleep on Dark Night of the Scarecrow. Um, like I said, this is one of my all-time favorite Halloween movies to watch. Um, Absolutely go and see this movie, if you have not already. Um, but yeah, that brings me to the next movie. So this next movie, not a horror film, more of a sci-fi film. I think it's considered as one of the greatest 80s movies and just greatest movies of all time. It's definitely up there as one of my absolute favorite films. You know, Halloween aside, because this movie does involve Halloween, this movie just in general is one of my all-time favorite movies. And to get on the Halloween side of things regarding this film, for many, Halloween is their favorite time of year. It's my favorite time of year, and for me, however, the true marker of Halloween's embrace, isn't just the decorations or the costumes, but just, a lot of these kind of annual, viewings of a lot of different movies that I watch around this time of year. And I think that there's no film out there that really kind of captures, um, Halloween aside, just in general, captures that kind of unique blend of wonder and just, a little touch of, the macabre and just profound, enduring heart, quite like Steven Spielberg's 1982 masterpiece, E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial. And while it's not explicitly, a horror film or a Halloween film, E.T. for me is an essential part of the Halloween viewing experience. It really offers this kind of different, perhaps deeper kind of enchantment that really resonates, long after, you've watched this film. Um, so E.T., at its core, E.T. the Extraterrestrial is just a story of profound connection. And I know this kind of seems like a theme because I just talked about this a little bit, with Dark Knight of the Scarecrow. But yeah, also E.T. is just as a story of profound connection and just that kind of universal, yearning um for home. And this was directed, by Steven Spielberg, and it was, written by Melissa Matheson. So this film introduces us to Elliot Taylor, who is this, lonely and imaginative, 10-year-old boy, just, navigating these kind of complexities of his, parents, recent divorce. So, his world is just suddenly and spectacularly, turned upside down when this small, gentle alien, who's accidentally left behind by his own kind, uh, during this kind of, this gathering of, things from Earth, takes refuge in this suburban landscape of California. And so Elliot nicknames this creature E.T. And against the kind of initial fear and apprehension, this there's this deep and unbreakable bond that forms between Elliot and ET. So the story follows Elliot, and his older brother Michael, and their younger sister Gertie, as they conspire together to keep ET hidden from their mother Mary, who's played by Dee Wallace. Um, and just also keep him from this kind of ominous presence of these government agents who are relentlessly hunting ET down. So the beginning of this kind of cinematic gem, lies in this deeply personal place for Steven Spielberg. The just the concept of a lonely child, forming this bond with this, imaginary, or in this case, extraterrestrial, um, this friend that stemmed from his kind of own experiences, following, his parents' divorce. And, in 1980, he collaborated with this writer, Melissa Matheson, and building upon this kind of earlier, unrealized project that they had titled Night Skies. So Melissa Matheson's, when she was writing this, it really produced, the first draft of the script, and initially called E.T. and Me. And, she did this in under 2 months, with, a few following rewrites, kind of owning the narrative as a whole. Um, and, just the film's journey, to the screen wasn't, without its hurdles, as most films are. Columbia Pictures initially passed on the project, deeming it kind of lacking this commercial appeal, only for Universal Pictures to acquire it for like $1 million or something, I think it was. So, the filming, commenced from September to December of 1981. And this was on a modest budget of like $10.5 million. And, a testament to Spielberg's vision for that genuine emotional performances. E.T. was shot in uh, this very rough chronological order, you know, allowing the young cast, particularly Henry Thomas as Elliot, to experience just the unfolding drama kind of organically, and just the iconic, expressive, animatronics for ET were the brainchild of the legendary Carlo Rambaldi. Um, ET premiered as the closing film at the Cannes Film Festival on May 26, 1982, before it ended up gracing American screens on June 11th of that same year. And the film was just this unprecedented, colossal success, shattering box office records and, eclipsing Star Wars. Came out in 1977, just about like 5 years prior to this. And it ended up becoming the highest grossing film of all time at that time. And that was a title that it held for 11 years until Spielberg's own Jurassic Park surpassed it. And, critically, E.T. garnered universal acclaim, solidifying its place as one of the most beloved and influential films ever made. Um, and just these kind of accolades, include 9 Academy Award nominations, they secured wins for Best Original Score, Best Visual Effects, Best Sound, Best Sound Editing, just alongside nominations for Best Picture and Best Director. It also swept up awards at the Saturn Awards and the Golden Globes. And just the film's enduring popularity, led to these re-releases in 1985 and then again in 2002 for its 20th anniversary, which it did feature these kind of controversial, updated effects and had scenes where they like replaced the guns with walkie-talkies or whatever. And then there was also a 40th anniversary IMAX release in 2022. But going back to in 1994, the Library of Congress recognized ET's, cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance by inducting it into the United States National Film Registry. Um, so, the story unfolds, with this race of these aliens descend upon Earth, under just the cloak of night. And, like I said, their mission to collect these plant specimens in a vast, Californian forest. And this just you have this one little curious alien who's drawn by this kind of distant glow of a suburban neighborhood and he wanders off. Um, this separation occurs just, as these US government agents arrive, and it causes, ET to flee. So, like I said, his family or whatever, the other aliens they're forced to make that departure, just leaving this lone member behind. Um, so, while these agents are like scouring the woods or whatever, ET, seeks refuge in this garden shed, belonging to Elliot and his family. He's initially frightened, and the creature is kind of like, eventually, lured back to the house by Elliot, who leaves a trail of, Reese's Pieces. And I think that's just a stroke of genius when it comes to product placement. And that's really become legendary and, definitely associated with ET to this day. Um, so Elliot, he hides ET in his room, and the next morning, he's faking the sickness so he can stay home from school. So he just kind of dedicates that day, to playing with this new companion in ET. And like I said, he soon introduces ET to his older brother Michael, and then his younger sister Gertie. Um, and who are just they vowed to keep this, a secret from their mother. Um, so, as their bond deepens, ET reveals he has these extraordinary abilities. He can levitate, these multiple balls to represent, his home system and the solar system or whatever. And he revives this like this withered flower, and most notably, he heals a cut on Elliot's finger. Um, and there's this like shared telepathic connection that allows Elliot and ET to experience each other's emotions and sensations. Elliot is startled when ET accidentally opens um I think it's an umbrella or something like that, a little bit away. And this connection even has like humorous, and although disruptive, consequences at school. Where Elliot becomes visibly intoxicated because ET is back at his house, drinking beer out of the fridge and watching television. And, there's this very pivotal moment of this shared empathy that occurs, in Elliot's biology class. So, since an ET's, desire to return home, Elliot impulsively releases all these frogs that are, that were destined to be dissected. Uh, and it's an act that just inspires his classmates to help him do the same. And in this scene that that really captures ET's budding understanding of human emotion, Elliot impulsively kisses this girl that he likes, um, and really mirroring this kiss that ET is observing on screen back at home on the TV set. Um, And it just really leads to this kind of amusing reprimand of Elliot at his school by the teacher or principal or whatever. Um, so after this, inspired by this kind of Buck Rogers comic strip, E.T. devises a plan to phone home. And just really, he constructs this communication device from these different household items, and he begins to learn English. And with the children's help, they embark on this quest for all these necessary components, unaware that the agents are closing in on them. So the iconic Halloween sequence, sees the children disguising ET as a ghost, um, and to kind of like trick their mom into thinking this is actually Gertie, their Elliot's younger sister, played by Drew Barrymore, underneath this sheet. So, Elliot sneaks, ET into the forest to activate this device that ET has made, and just he's pleading with ET to stay. So he falls asleep, only to awaken alone the next day. And Elliot's kind of weakened state upon returning home, parallels ET's own declining health. So Michael goes out and he finds ET near death in this kind of culvert, and he brings him home just as the government and the government agents they arrive and they storm the house. So the lead agent Keys, who is this character who's revealed to have harbored this childhood dream of encountering aliens, he implores Elliot's help in saving ET. And this it's a profound moment of just shared understanding and respect starts to blossom between the two. However, ET appears to die, as Elliot is beginning to recover. And this is one of the hardest parts in the movie for me to watch every single time, no matter how many times I've watched this. It's in this kind of heartbreaking, goodbye that Elliot, professes his love, and then ET's heart starts to glow, and it brings him back to life. And ET reveals that his people are finally coming back for him. And so this legendary, iconic chase ensues as Elliot and Michael, with ET on their bikes, and they're aided by their friends. They evade these kind of pursuing authorities. And again, one of the most iconic scenes in cinematic history. ET uses his powers to levitate these boys, um, over this kind of roadblock, landing them safely into the forest. And then as the alien's ship starts to ascend, ET, he bids farewell to Michael and Gertie, who gives him this revived flower. And the goodbye between Elliot and ET, Elliot's very tearful plea for ET to stay is just kind of met with this touch on his forehead, and this promise of eternal presence when he says, "I'll be right here." So, as the ship kind of vanishes into the cosmos, really leaving this vibrant rainbow in its wake, um, the characters and the audience are just left with this very beautiful, profound sense of loss and of love, and just the enduring possibility of connection across just the vastness of the universe. um but the visionary behind ET, um is of course, as I said, the legendary Steven Spielberg. He is one of the most successful and influential filmmakers in history. He's renowned for his unparalleled ability to blend, that grand spectacle with just deeply intimate human stories. Um, Spielberg's filmography spans just a wide range of genres, but he is particularly celebrated for his skill and just crafting these stories that just evoke a sense of wonder and adventure and emotional resonance. Um, you know his early career was marked by groundbreaking blockbusters like movies I've talked about in the past, like Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which established him as this kind of master, of suspense and just, a visionary in depicting, these extraterrestrial encounters. You know, E.T. cemented his reputation for just creating, emotionally resonant family films, that would touch upon these universal themes of childhood and friendship and belonging. And he continued to explore these themes in films like Empire of the Sun and Hook. And just beyond his work with wonder and childhood, Spielberg also just demonstrated his kind of versatility and dramatic prowess with just acclaimed historical dramas and war films like Schindler's List, which earned him an Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Director, and then he did Saving Private Ryan in 1998, which also garnered him a Best Director Oscar. I mean, other films in his career, like Jurassic Park, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and those sequels, and Minority Report, Catch Me If You Can. The list goes on and on. Spielberg is known just for his distinctive visual style, his ability to kind of elicit these powerful performances from actors, especially young ones, and just his consistent ability to connect with audiences on an emotional level, just making him a true titan of Hollywood. And for this movie in particular, like I've heard stories about like um, you know, his bond with young Drew Barrymore, and he really served as like a father figure for her. And you know, I've heard the stories of like the young Drew Barrymore thinking that ET was real. So, between scenes of being filmed, they Spielberg would have these like puppeteers hide behind a wall and operate the ET animatronic to have conversations with the young Drew Barrymore just to keep, that touch of magic alive inside of her, when she didn't have really a father figure in her life, other than Spielberg himself. And to me, that's absolutely touching and absolutely beautiful, and I love that. Um, but the legacy and impact of ET is nothing short of monumental. It's resonated through decades and just influenced, countless aspects of pop culture and filmmaking and just even like I said, that collective understanding of connection. Um, as I mentioned, ET wasn't just a film. It's a global phenomenon. It's just the unprecedented box office success really redefined what a blockbuster could be. And it proved that, this heartfelt, character driven story could, outsell even the most ambitious sci fi epics like Star Wars. So, this success, it opened the doors for more, you know, intimate narratives to kind of receive major studio backing and widespread release, and it just really shifted the whole cinematic landscape as we knew it back in those days. The film's merchandising was also revolutionary. It really just created this blueprint for how beloved characters could transcend the screen and just become tangible parts of everyday life through toys and games and all these other products. Um, and at its heart, ET, you know, it taps into that kind of fundamental, human experience of, loneliness, friendship, just that desire for connection, and just the pain of separation. Elliot's, bond with ET, offered audiences, particularly children, and those who felt like outsiders, this kind of powerful representation of finding that acceptance and finding that love, and just the film's portrayal of this of a found family where Elliot and Michael and Gertie, they all come together to protect and to nurture ET. It really resonated deeply, not just with me, um, just but especially in these kind of post-divorce world where family structures were evolving, and the theme of empathy where Elliot and ET, um they literally feel each other's emotions, is just a profound exploration of that kind of interconnectedness. And that definitely just continues to inspire to this very day, over 40 years later. um you know Spielberg's decision to shoot ET in that rough chronological order was definitely a significant departure, from typical filmmaking practices, at that time. This allowed, the young actors, especially, said Henry Thomas, who played Elliot, to kind of develop their emotional arcs authentically, and it resulted in performances that just feel remarkably genuine, and raw, and just that the masterful use of just, animatronics and these kind of subtle, visual effects, particularly with ET's, expressive face and his movements and all that. It really set a new standard, for just creating these kind of believable non-human characters. Um, the film's pacing and splendid moments of quiet intimacy, and with these kind of thrilling bursts of action and suspense, it really became like a model for many, following family adventure films. Um, and the iconic imagery, ET in the basket, ET with the glowing finger, the bikes flying across the moon, it's just all become deeply, ingrained in the whole cinematic lexicon, and in my brain and a lot of other people's brains, it's all that's burned into our brains. It's just kind of free, and it's frequently referenced and parodied in several parts of the media. Um, but ET, it really presented this very radical departure from just the typical portrayal of aliens in science fiction. Instead of the more menacing, invaders common in earlier films, ET was depicted as this very vulnerable, curious, and just um, this curious being. This kind of subverted, these established themes, and allowed audiences to engage with the idea, of this extraterrestrial life through a lens of like compassion and wonder, and rather than fear. And it really paved the way, for a new wave of friendly alien stories, um and just really demonstrated, the kind of commercial viability of, portraying aliens in a um non-threatening manner. Um, and for a generation, who grew up with ET, the film remains a powerful touchstone of just childhood and innocence. Like I said, the Reese's Pieces connection, the iconic phrases like "ET phone home," and Just just that unforgettable score by John Williams. I haven't even mentioned John Williams' score yet, but like, yeah, it just all evokes this kind of deep sense of nostalgia. And that's me in a nutshell. Like, nostalgia is extremely important to me. And these films like E.T., or Gremlins or Goonies or whatever it may be, that were part of my childhood, part of me establishing who I am. It just all has this enduring appeal that has led, to dedicated fan communities, and, a lot of frequent re-releases, and just continued presence, in pop culture. Um, just ensuring, that new generations are introduced, to its magic. And to touch a little bit on the Halloween connection, and while it's not explicitly a horror film, um, ET's core themes and imagery, lend themselves surprisingly well to, a Halloween viewing experience. Just, the initial scenes of ET, hiding in the shadows, the sense of mystery and the unknown, just the agents, kind of shadowy pursuit of ET, and also, of course, the iconic disguise of ET as a ghost, all carry this certain eerie, atmospheric quality that just resonates, with the spirit of Halloween. However, it's the film's ultimate message, of love and acceptance, and just, the magic of friendship, that truly what elevates this movie. Halloween for many is just, a time of embracing the fantastical and the spooky, while, also celebrating community and shared joy and whatever. Um, ET perfectly encapsulates this kind of duality, just offering these kind of thrilling moments, and, a touch of the otherworldly, and it's all kind of wrapped in this very profound emotional core that just leaves a warm, lasting glow, much like ET's own heart. Um, it's a film that just, acknowledges the shadows, but, ultimately, celebrates the light, embodying that spirit of wonder, and, that the best of Halloween can bring. Um, but, ET is more than just a film to me. This movie is one hell of an experience. It's just a testament to the power of childhood perspective, just the boundless capacity for love and connection, and just, the that enduring magic can that can be found, when we open our hearts to the unknown. Um, and again, that's me in a nutshell, because, I don't know a stranger. I will show kindness to anyone in this world, especially those if I feel that they need when they need it the most. Um, and, also as just a lifelong fan of films, just with a particular fondness for, that kind of cinematic tapestry of Halloween. You know, I think that ET stands as a beacon, and a beacon of hope in a lot of ways. It offers not the jump scares of a horror movie, but the more the goosebumps of a profound kind of emotional discovery. It is that gentle, touch of a finger that glows. The silent understanding between species, and just that, like I said, that universal yearning for home. Every viewing of this movie is just a reminder that, that even in the face of loneliness and fear, the extraordinary can find us, and friendship can transcend galaxies. You know what I mean? Like it's I love that overall message, and for these reasons, so many more, ET will forever hold a special place in my heart, in my Halloween viewing traditions, and just yeah, this is one of the greatest movies of all time. 100%. You cannot go wrong with ET. Um, if you don't feel something when you watch this movie, um, I don't know how you have a fucking soul. But um, yeah, so definitely. And if you've never watched ET, good Lord, get on that ASAP. Please watch this movie. Come back after you've watched the movie and let me know what you thought about it in the comments because I would love to have a conversation about that. But moving on, because I think I've spent enough time talking about ET, but I had to. I mean, like I said, I feel this is one of my all time favorite movies. It's one of the greatest movies ever made. So I really had to put some extra time talking about this movie. Um, but that brings me to the next movie, which was this next movie was a first time watch for me. I had never watched this movie before. I'd always heard people talk about it, say it was a really bad movie. I mean, it's really super cheesy, super camp. But sometimes that's what I love hearing because that just makes me want to watch a movie like that even more. Um, and with this movie, while many people I think will flock to more modern horror offerings, during the Halloween season, um, my heart holds a special place for all things, Halloween related, especially like the delightfully old fashioned. Those films that kind of capture the spirit, of Halloween with a lighter, more magical touch. And when I watched this movie for the first time this year, I I really didn't know like what to think about it at first, but after watching all of it and just really kind of like getting the whole effect of it, this movie, which is the 1986 British musical fantasy, The Worst Witch, it's a film that just kind of has this comforting blend of of mild peril and just genuine warmth, and just it's just a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun watching this movie. um the Worst Witch is just this loving, adaptation of the first book in Jill Murphy's beloved series, and it transports us to Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches. So here, amidst these bubbling cauldrons and these flying broomsticks, we meet Mildred Hubble, who's played with this kind of endearing earnestness by Fairuza Balk, a very young Fairuza Balk. Um, and Mildred, is as the title suggests, spectacularly bad at being a witch. Um, so, her attempts at just casting even the simplest spells, often kind of result in this very comical chaos. Like classmates tripping over thin air, and, accidental invisibility spells, and just even this kind of rather memorable transformation of the school bully, Ethel, into a pig. So, the cast is just a veritable treasure, trove of British acting talent. Charlotte Rae, brings this wonderfully maternal yet firm presence as Miss Cackle, while Diana Rigg, in a role that feels tailor made for her, just embodies this kind of stern and formidable Miss Hardbroom, with this just exquisite precision. Um, so, just adding a dash of eccentric charm is Tim Curry, who, his grand wizard appearance is just a standout moment in the film, especially during the film's kind of thrilling Halloween climax. The musical numbers, particularly Bonnie Langford's rendition of "Growing Up Isn't Easy," just adds, another layer of charm. Kind of weaving the story together with these kind of catchy tunes. And the film is directed by Campbell Graham, who's a filmmaker whose work in television, particularly in children's drama and musical genres, um, perf- perfectly set the stage for this kind of um, whimsical tale, if you will. So while he's not a household name for um, blockbuster movies, he really understood like the nuances of creating these engaging stories, for younger audiences. Just focusing on character development and just that sense of wonder. Um, so his direction here is just clear and focused. It allows the charm of the story and its performance to kind of shine without kind of unnecessary flourishes. Um, and the legacy of the worst witch is undeniable. I think even if it often operates in the shadow of its more famous magical successor, which we'll get to in just a moment. It's a pioneering work in bringing just a school for witches to the screen with such a just a focus on the everyday struggles of a young witch. And that impact lies in its foundational depiction of this magical school, this magical academy, and its emphasis on just friendship and perseverance, and just that ability to kind of make magic feel both accessible and relatable. And getting back to, like I said, that I was going to talk about, the film's influence can certainly be seen in later works. And, while comparisons to Harry Potter are inevitable here, The Worst Witch, just kind of offers this distinctly different flavor about it. Um, Now, where Harry Potter kind of delves into darker themes and the kind of intricate lore, um, The Worst Witch remains a more innocent and comedic exploration of just of magical education. Um, you know, just focusing on Mildred's kind of personal journey of self acceptance and really finding her place. Um, it's a gentler kind of magic, kind of rooted in like everyday mishaps and just that simple joy, of overcoming one's own limitations. Um, but I guess in conclusion, The Worst Witch is a film that deserves to be celebrated, in my opinion, especially by fans, of Halloween movies. It's just a delightful blend of comedy and fantasy and the heartwarming storytelling. And it's all elevated by this very stellar cast and just a script that never really takes itself too seriously. I mean, if you're looking for a serious movie here, you're going to watch the wrong movie, and you're probably not going to enjoy it. But it's I think it's a reminder that sometimes the most magical stories are the ones where the hero stumbles and fails and just ultimately will triumph through this kind of sheer determination. um and so for anyone, seeking, kind of, this dose of charmingly imperfect magic, this Halloween, you're looking for something different, look no further than Mildred Hubble and her, wonderfully, chaotic adventures at Miss Cackle's Witch Academy. It's a timeless classic, I think. And even though this is my first time seeing it, I feel like this is a movie that I could watch around the Halloween season every year. Um, it just and I think I think everyone should check this out. I believe so. I watched the full movie is on YouTube. So if you want to go and watch this movie, the full movie is on YouTube. That's where I watched it. Definitely would love to know what people think about this one. Um, but that brings me to the last film that I'm going to talk about for tonight's show. And as I said earlier, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow is one of my all time favorite Halloween movies to watch. the last movie I'm going to be talking about tonight is another one of those all-time favorite Halloween movies to watch. But overall, it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time as well. And again, for those of us who live and breathe Halloween, it's not just a holiday. It's a state of mind at this point. To me, every day is Halloween, and that's how I live. I live by that. It's to and with Halloween, it's the crisp air that, like I said earlier, the rustling leaves, the scent of pumpkin spice, or whatever it may be for you personally. But also more importantly for me as a horror fan, it's that world of horror cinema that you kind of stays within that whole spirit of Halloween and the season. Um, and within this kind of hallowed world of seasonal scares, this movie, Night of the Demons, Kevin Tenney's Night of the Demons from 1988, just holds a particularly special place in my heart when it comes to horror cinema. It embodies everything that I adore about horror and Halloween movies. It has a killer premise, just unforgettable characters, practical effects, humor. It just it still holds up, to this day. Just a with this kind of devil may care attitude that screams, party on. This this film isn't just a watch. It's a ritual for me, and this is a movie that I would typically watch multiple times a year in the past. Not just around the Halloween season, but just multiple times throughout the year. And it's just but for the Halloween season in general, it's just a beloved tradition for me that I revisit this every October with just the same kind of anticipation as doing anything else I would do during the Halloween season. Um, so let's go ahead and just jump into this wonderfully wicked heart that is Night of the Demons. So it was directed by Kevin Tenney, and it was written by Joe Augustine. This 1988 gem of a movie just plunges us head first, into this Halloween night gone spectacularly and demonically wrong. Um, so the premise is, just it's very simple. It's yet kind of brimming, with potential. So this group of high schoolers, are seeking, a thrill and just escape from the kind of mundane. They decide to throw this party, at the notoriously haunted Hull House. So this isn't just any kind of abandoned building. It's this former funeral parlor, just kind of steeped in a very dark and gruesome past. Just a place where evil spirits are rumored to linger. And this setup is just pure Halloween gold. A creepy, isolated location. A just a forbidden place, and just kind of this group of unsuspecting teens that are just ripe for terror. Give me just a moment. So the night begins with just a touch of kind of ominous foreshadowing as Stooge and Helen and Roger are driving towards the party, and they encounter this elderly man carrying apples with razor blades concealed within them. So this kind of immature prank of mooning him results in a chilling curse from him, like they'll get what they deserve or whatever he says. Um, and this kind of seemingly minor interaction kind of plants this seed of dread, hinting that the night's mischief will indeed have these dire consequences. So at Hull House, the this teenage clique begins to kind of mingle, and Angela, who is like the the teenage outcast who has, she's orchestrated this whole event, is, joined by familiar faces like Suzanne, played by the greatest scream queen of all time, Linnea Quigley. Then you have Helen and Roger and Stooge and Judy, and then her boyfriend Jay. And then you even have Sal Romero, who is Judy's ex. He comes there to try to crash the party, and it kind of adds another layer, of that social tension, that's common within teenagers. Um, so, like the initial party vibes are established. There's music, there's dancing, but it's not long before the supernatural starts to take over. So, Angela kind of embracing her role as the slightly, unsettling gothic host, suggests this Halloween party game where they do a seance. So this is where the real horror kind of start to ignite into the film. So during the seance, the veil between worlds starts to thin, and Helen experiences this kind of terrifying, premonition, and where she sees this demon in a mirror, and the mirror shatters, just kind of foreshadowing her own, gruesome fate as she sees that in the mirror as well. Um, so the group, then hears these kind of unsettling noises from below them. And just the true horror is unleashed as this demon, previously sealed within the crematorium, breaks free. And its first victim is Suzanne, who is, becomes possessed after this kind of seemingly, you know, um, just like spirit comes within her. And then she kind of, then after beyond this, she shares this kind of seemingly innocent kiss with Angela, transferring that demonic spirit into Angela as well. So this kind of insidious transfer of demonic possession, starting with that kiss, just quickly establishes the film's kind of unique brand of, of body horror and, that unsettling, intimacy. Um, so, the film then spirals into this kind of chaotic and just increasingly brutal series of possessions and these gruesome deaths. So, Jay, who, is a character that's revealed to be more, self-serving than, genuinely interested in Judy, he abandons her to go to try to find Suzanne. And then you have Roger and Helen. They find themselves trapped, with, Helen ended up in her death. Then Stooge, in this kind of naive pursuit of Suzanne, you know, um, falls prey to, Suzanne's kind of seductive, now demonically possessed form. And then, same thing with Angela as well. He find, she, in her kind of like demonically possessed form, she seduces him as well, and then he ends up losing his tongue in this kind of horrifying kiss with Angela. So Jay's encounter with the possessed Suzanne, however, leads to this very violent and, graphic death for Jay. And later after this, the possessed Stooge then kind of brutally murders Max and Franny, when they're in the coffin, which is a very darkly ironic twist, on their kind of intimate moment they were having. So then you just the remaining survivors. You have Sal, you have Judy, and you have Roger, and they all find themselves in this kind of desperate, fight for survival. And Sal witnesses Angela's disturbing, defiance of pain, and, her hands and just engulfed in flames without flinching, and she's just laughing about it. And Roger, initially escaping by sleeping in the car, is jolted awake by, Helen's body crashing onto the car. So, you know, they liberate Judy, but the house becomes this kind of nightmarish labyrinth with, just the openly demonic Angela just hot on their heels. So Sal, he has this very futile attempt to protect Judy, and it ends up leading to his death. So Judy, who's now just, seemingly a lone survivor, facing these kind of overwhelming odds, finds herself pursued by this entire malevolent horde. And, just in a pivotal moment, when Judy and Roger meet back up, and when she realizes that Roger is a survivor as well, they barricade themselves in the crematorium, just the very place that the demon was unleashed. So here, they start to uncover, just the horrifying truth about this demonic entity. So just as Angela and the now possessed Stooge, breach their sanctuary, Judy was just this kind of flash of resourcefulness. Ignites gas from a pipe, creating this kind of fiery inferno that pushes the demons back. Um, so the climax sees Judy and Roger, cornered on the roof, just by the grotesque parade of these possessed bodies, the burnt Angela, the tongueless Stooge, and, the undead forms of Suzanne and Jay and Max and Franny and Helen and Sal. And just their desperate escape over this barbed wire fence, with the demons, attempting to drag Judy back down, is just a very tense and this visceral sequence. But as the sun rises, it's the purifying light from the sun starts to vanquish, all these possessed corpses, just banishing the demons, back to hell from whence they came. And the final image is just really a chilling echo of the beginning, where you have Judy and Roger, they're walking back home, and they pass by that same elderly man who cursed them from the beginning of the film. And so he in turn prepares to enjoy a slice, of his wife's homemade pie, only to discover it's too late, that it's filled with the razor blades that he intended for trick-or-treaters. And, his wife's kind of casual, happy Halloween, dear, is just that perfect, darkly comedic, punctuation to this kind of night of just pure demonic chaos. And as I said, Kevin Tenney is the director and the co-writer of Night of the Demons. And when it comes to horror, honestly, Kevin Tenney is one of my all-time favorite horror directors. And for fans of practical effects driven 80s horror, he is a beloved figure. Kevin Tenney is just known for, his ability to craft these low budget, high impact horror films that just emphasize atmosphere and creature effects and just, this kind of sense of unbridled fun. And before Night of the Demons, he directed Witch House, which is another kind of demonic possession flick. And he also did Witchboard as well, which I absolutely love Witchboard. But while his filmography isn't super extensive, he also did another film later on called Pinocchio's Revenge, which I love that as well. Um, his work on Night of the Demons really cemented his legacy, within the cult horror scene. He's just a craftsman that, who understood that kind of appeal of straightforward, visceral scares, and just embraced that kind of inherent, theatricality of the genre. Um, and the legacy of Night of the Demons is just a testament to that enduring, power of just cult cinema. Upon its release in 1988, just like a lot of other movies I've talked about on this channel, it was just met with kind of a mixed critical reception. Some critics found it, derivative and gory, while others acknowledged its kind of energetic, pacing and those creative scares. However, like many genre films that just defy, immediate critical acclaim, Now the Demons just found this audience on home video, as a lot of, movies from that time period did. It's just, it's unique blend of demonic possession and creative practical effects, and just this kind of surprisingly, sympathetic hero or heroine in Judy, really resonated with horror fans. They were just hungry for something fresh and exciting. During that time. Um, just the cult classic status of Night of the Demons has just firmly establish itself. Its inclusion in just numerous best of lists for 80s horror or Halloween horror. Its continued availability on like streaming platforms and just a lot of passionate discussions between fans online. It all really point to that kind of lasting appeal. And it's a film that just has been, discovered and rediscovered by, multiple generations of these horror enthusiasts. Um, and Amelia Kincaid just has an iconic performance here. Her portrayal of Angela is just nothing short of mesmerizing. The whole stigmata song dance that she does in the film is just absolutely mesmerizing. Just her transition from this kind of somewhat awkward party host to this seductive, terrifyingly unhinged demon is really like a tour de force. Her performance is really a cornerstone, of the film's success, and it's really has made Angela, I think one of horror's most memorable female villains. Um, and just that kind of her blend of allure and that sheer menace is just captivating, I think, and terrifying in kind of an equal measure. Um, but the practical effects and like the gory ingenuity within this film, so in an era where CGI was non-existent pretty much. Um, Night of the Demons, relied heavily on practical effects. The demon transformations, the gruesome injuries, and just that kind of overall unsettling, creature design are all just products of skilled hands-on artistry. And Steve Johnson, did a lot of the practical effects here on this. And I think at this time, I think he was married to Linnea Quigley, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong with it, but I know they were together at one point. But anyway, the practical effects, while perhaps dated to some people, really possess this very tangible, visceral quality that just still holds up and, contributes significantly to the film's kind of unnerving, atmosphere. Um, just the sheer creativity and in depicting this the demonic onslaught, from Stooge's severed tongue to to Jay's gouged out eyes. It remains as kind of a highlight for a lot of gore hounds out there, including myself. And I love the whole Halloween party gone wrong theme with this movie. While it's not the first film to explore this kind of theme, Night of the Demons really executed it with just a very particular flair and just intensity that just really made it, a benchmark for that. Um, the film just perfectly captures that kind of youthful desire for, a memorable Halloween party. And then it expertly twists that desire into this kind of night of just unparalleled terror. So this kind of theme, while common, is just executed here with just a relentless energy that just makes it feel, fresh and dangerous. Um, and just the film's success inevitably led to, a franchise. So we got Night of the Demons 2, Night of the Demons 3 that would follow, each with kind of varying degrees of success and, capturing that magic of the original. But, the franchise was later rebooted with a 2009 remake that had Shannon Elizabeth and, I think Edward Furlong and Linnea Quigley even has a cameo in that. I think a few others. I'm not sure. I can't remember if Amelia Kincaid has a cameo in it or not. But because it's been a long time since I've watched the remake, it just kind of indicated that enduring appeal of the core concept of the original. And while the sequels and the remake kind of may not have reached the same heights as the original, they're their existence, just I think speaks to that kind of foundational power of Kevin Tenney's original vision. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Night of the Demons is more than just a horror movie. It's just an essential piece, of the Halloween cinematic tapestry. For those of us who cherish, the holidays spooky spirit, this film just delivers in spades. It's a perfect storm of a terrifying premise, a cast that just kind of fully commits to the mayhem and just an unrestrained enthusiasm for all things wicked and fun. The film doesn't shy away from its gore, nor does it pretend to be anything more than a, thrilling demonic party. Um, it's a testament, to the power of practical effects, and just a reminder that sometimes, the most memorable horror comes from a lot of unexpected places, like an abandoned funeral parlor on Halloween night. It's a film that, with its kind of blood splattered charm and that demonic glee, it continues to just haunt my Halloween viewing habits. And for that, I'm eternally grateful for that. So, if you're looking for a film that, that truly embodies the spirit of Halloween, the scares, the fun, and just that sheer, unadulterated terror, then, gather up your friends, your family, your coworkers, whoever, and just, invite a demon or two into your home. No, not really. I'm just joking. And just, yeah, check out Night of the Demons. You will not regret it. But your sanity might. So, happy Halloween. Definitely check out Night of the Demons, and definitely check out uh, the next two episodes of Halloween Hoedown here on CraterMania on YouTube. Um, so that's it for tonight's episode. Like I said, I will be back tomorrow night with 5 more movies I'll be talking about for Halloween Hoedown. And then again on Sunday night for 5 more movies for that night for this series. I want to thank all of you that has took the time just to either watch this live or you're watching this on replay. Just appreciate all of you guys very, very much. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of these is, or just tell me about another Halloween movie that you love very much, and I would love to converse with you about that. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. That'd help me out a lot. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below. Tell your friends, tell your family, your coworkers about CraterMania. Get them to subscribe as well. I would really appreciate that. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. But like I said, I will be back tomorrow night. I'll be back on Sunday night as well, talking about more movies based around the spirit and season of Halloween. But with all that said, for tonight, I am Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.